Small businesses with insurance, risk management, and employee benefits using the same values they've held true for over 30 years: knowledge, vision, accountability, and service. More information is at bmbinc.com.
Hello, I'm Marcia Cavanaugh. Thanks so much for joining us. Well, on this Thanksgiving weekend, among the gifts for which to be thankful are that, 1, we live in a democracy, and that 2, elections are over, at least for now. There is, nevertheless, much to be learned from voting results, including not just the winners, but the character and concerns of the electorate. We'll analyze the outcome. For some people this weekend, the table is less bountiful, and our Future Watch segment looks at hunger locally, how it's measured, and what's being done about it. And in health news, we will examine what seems to be a sudden outbreak of Superbowl fever. Starting for us are tonight's Informed Sources. Errol Laborde, producer of Informed Sources. Kevin Litten, reporter, NOLA.com, The Times-Picayune. Don Ostron, Channel 12's Future Watch reporter. And Jeff Adelson, reporter, The New Orleans Advocate. We're going to go over to Kevin first and begin a discussion about the outcome of the mayor's race. We have the winner, LaToya Cantrell, and it just really has been an interesting race and an interesting outcome.
Yeah, I mean, a historic outcome, which we knew was going to happen because we got our first female mayor out of it. But then I think when you got to election night, everybody thought that LaToya Cantrell had a really good shot at winning this. The question was how big the margin was going to be. I don't even think that LaToya Cantrell's people would have predicted that it was going to be a 20-point victory. I mean, she's really able to come in saying that she has a mandate, saying that she represents kind of a new class of New Orleans voters. And I think I talked to somebody on the that's close to the Charbonnet campaign, and they talked about this idea that, wow, this really woke us up to the fact that the fabric of the city has really started to change.
Mm-hmm. All right, we're going to talk about that a little bit more, but first, I'd like to hear from you. What did Cantrell do right, and what did Charbonnet lack?
I think it helped Cantrell to be running for office really early. So she was able to identify voters in a really targeted way starting a year ago. Those voters turned out to be very loyal to her. And I think once they did identify those voters and knew who they were, they just kept going after them. They hit them on social media. They hit them with some direct mail. And they were able to do it in a way that their budget really only allowed for. One thing that I was skeptical about going into this campaign is that Charbonnet started out with so much money in the race. I thought that you would get into the runoff and she would just bury us all in television advertisements and that LaToya would really get drowned out. But that didn't really happen. I mean, every time you went on Facebook, if they were a voter that they thought that they had, you were seeing LaToya or one of her surrogates out there supporting her.
She used a lot of social media and really appealed to the millennial vote.
Yeah, Cantrell did a really good job of targeting the millennials, getting, and not just millennials, and not just with social either. She had a whole army of canvassers that were on the ground, knocking on doors, making phone calls. Some of them, especially early on, because of the differential in the fundraising, some of them were volunteers that just, showed up, made phone calls. Some of them were paid. And I think one of the things that really is sort of striking about how this race went is, as Kevin said, Cantrell's voters were voters and donors were very loyal to her. Charbonnet's were less loyal, and you can see that when you look at the campaign finance reports that were filed in the runoff. Charbonnet came out of the gate with $850,000 in her bank account in the first week she was running. After the primary, her fundraising absolutely dried up. There were points when she was in debt. She actually, I've heard she had to, loan her campaign some money just to keep it afloat. So you really just didn't see that kind of core committed supporters. And frankly, that may in part be one of the main problems with the Charbonnet campaign, which was they never really defined their own candidate in a way that separated her out, and particularly that defined her more strongly than some of the PACs that were going after her. I mean, you had the Not For Sale NOLA PAC, which was Leslie Jacobs and some other business council type people. You had Sidney Torrez going after Charbonnet, and those really set the tone for how voters thought about Desiree Charbonnet. And her campaign didn't really do a good job of saying, this is who we are and this is what we stand for.
Of course, she had some real big names endorsing her, including Congressman Richmond. But like you said, also she just had big attacks from the PACs. So did her not showing up for for Sidney Torres's forum, let's say, or debate, some people say, boy, that was a strategic error. She should have gone there. Was that a big mistake, do you think?
I think it was probably a mistake because you didn't want to have two PACs attacking you, and that was the result. Although I think Sidney Torres may have found a way to attack her either way. He seemed to be pretty upset even going into that race. I think that one other thing that's interesting to think about when it comes to Charbonnet is that they ran this really traditional campaign in the sense that I thought they were a little slower to react on social media. I thought that they really kind of got all those endorsements lined up. They got all the big politicians supporting them. And then in the end, people looked at that and they thought, well, I'm not sure that I want that traditional candidate. I'm looking at LaToya Cantrell. She seems like the outsider. Maybe this was the year of the outsider. And those voters really stuck with her.
And for most of New Orleans history, if you had those groups lined up, I mean, she had every traditional political organization. She was Cedric Richmond's candidate, as you've pointed out. She even had, and I think this hurt her, but she had, Steve Scalise and Leon Cannizzaro, which I think both of those endorsements really probably hurt her in the black community. But every member of the traditional political establishment had lined up behind Charbonnet. And in a lot of years, certainly in the pre-Nagin years, that would have been enough. And what we saw in this election absolutely turned that conventional wisdom on its head.
Well, it was the traditional establishment in black politics, and that's a whole different swath of groups than what they used to be. I mean, this was like the old groups like Bold and Coup and
Bold was backing LaToya.
Yeah, but when you talk about it, those are what the groups are, and so that was one difference. I think another thing that accounted for the percentage was that by the last week, all the polls were saying that Cantrell had a double-digit lead. A double-digit lead can be 10 points or something. It was. It becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, though, when someone is showing a strong enough lead. By the time you get to election day, people say, well, look, this person's losing. They got a double-digit lose. And so a lot of times you see a shift of people just going, when to go with the win. Now, if it's a real close election, then they think differently. When you see that sort of thing, I think that has an impact also.
Well, I want some comments from you guys about what does this tell us about the electorate now?
One thing that I thought was interesting is that a lot of New Orleans campaigns, and especially mayoral races, have broken down along racial lines. And in this race, you had two black candidates. So I asked the question of somebody, do you think that it would have been a much different result if there had been a white candidate and a black candidate in the race? And they said, no, I think what the difference would have been is if there had been a man in the race and a woman in the race, and the woman probably would have prevailed. And I think in what we have to learn from that with LaToya Cantrell is that she had this way to reach women voters, and women voters seemed to really stick by her. And I think that gave her a nice lead when you went into the primary. But then, man, when you got into the runoff, then you started pulling over all of those voters from Bagneris and Troy Henry, and that really seemed to get her that coalition that got her the mandate.
Well, I think that's right. And the racial breakdown in this race is actually really interesting because Cantrell won about 70% of the black vote and 54% of the white vote. And those kind of numbers are gonna rocket you to victory regardless. What's interesting is that left Charbonnet as essentially the white candidate. She did a lot better in the white community than she did in the black community, and particularly in the more conservative white precincts that Bagneris had won in the primary election. So she won Lakeview, she won those white precincts all the way out in the east, English Turn, all those areas. And I think that shows that, the signaling that her campaign was doing with Scalise, with Cannizzaro, with their focus on we're going to be tough on crime, got them the voters they wanted, but also lost them a lot of the voters that they were hoping to get in the rest of the city, which largely didn't agree with that.
Okay.
Oh, sorry. The other thing that's interesting is the one area of Bagneris's white voters that Charbonnet didn't get were the ones near Audubon, Uptown, which is the Leslie Jacobs, Jay LaPere area, and those are the business council people that were backing Not for Sale NOLA.
Right.
So what you clearly had sort of a break in how, wealthier or at least above average income whites were viewing the two candidates, whether they were sort of having a maybe a socially conservative versus a business conservative mindset about them. But there's definitely sort of an interesting split in that conservative
The interesting
vote.
thing about that, too, is I think that those voters that Jeff is referring to, I don't think they are necessarily seeing or saw Cantrell as their candidate. I think they saw Charbonnet as the candidate that they didn't want.
I think
and so
that's absolutely
Cantrell was
right.
an acceptable alternative.
Newcomer impact. What do you think?
I think there probably was some. I think the number of newcomers we've had probably made it a lot easier for someone who wasn't born here to win, and probably reduced some of the impact of, Charbonnet made a major part of her campaign, her family's long roots.
Not for
I
Sale
don't
NOLA
know
was
that
it was not a newcomer PAC. That was not from a newcomer, but it was certainly launched in such a way that said, we don't want to go back to this old way of politics that some of us remember. And hey, you newcomers too, you don't want that either, do you? And I think that there was some of that resonated. But I think Cantrell was also a formidable candidate and ran a really flawless campaign with very few mistakes. And I think there's a lot to be said for that.
60-40, yeah, that is a lot to be said for that. We need to move over to council now. And we're going to have a really interesting council coming up next May when they all take office. So two council districts that were up for grabs for this race for the runoff, B and E. Let's go to B first.
So B, Jay Banks won over Seth Bloom. Banks should definitely be noted is a strong member of Bold, which LaToya Cantrell is as well, and it's run by Karen Carter Peterson, the state senator and Democratic Party chair for the state. So really good night for that organization. That puts them in a very powerful position that I don't think a lot of people necessarily saw them taking on coming out of this. That race was very interesting because that was one of two of the most racially divided contests in this election. The other one being Kristen Gilson-Palmer versus Nadine Ramsey. But if you look at where the votes came in those races, it was clearly split on a black-white divide.
Okay, and then District E now, with an incumbent James Gray voted out.
I think that's one of the fascinating races in this campaign. I mean, if you think about American cities across the country, immigrants are reshaping a lot of communities in large American cities. New Orleans is no exception, and that's been going on in the East with the Vietnamese community for a long time. And Cindy Nguyen was able to take what I think was some significant anger against a lack of responsiveness with James Gray's office, combine that with her strength in the Vietnamese community, and becomes our first Vietnamese council member. As an immigrant story, really interesting. And I think it will be really interesting to see what kind of a council member she becomes, because even though she's out there representing a majority black community, she can still be this really sort of maverick candidate on the council if she wants to be. She doesn't really have political alliances that she needs to worry about. And she also just has a community that has a lot of needs that are going to be asking for a lot of things.
That district has a long history of dissatisfied voters. Of all the council district, that's the district over time that has had the most turnover, and it's because people said we didn't do anything, and people don't want to invest there. It's a poor district. It's widespread. It's a hard sell. If something would happen with the Jazzland site or with the old Michoud site, that would make a difference. But it's a difficult district, and it's a district, and this is one where the race thing really broke down because the black vote, I think, was like 87%.
87% of the vote.
And then you saw a Vietnamese candidate, and the Vietnamese community does have a lot of cohesion, and so I think there's a lot of interaction between those parts of the community, and so that's good. But also about District B, that I wanted to mention, of all those old acronym groups, the SOUL and the COO and all that, one thing that really grounded Bold was that they also had something called the Dry Street Y. And the Dry Street Y is has been a very important center in that community, a cultural center, and so a lot of the leadership from Bolt has come out of that, and it's very endearing to people in that community.
So I do want to get you guys to comment a little bit about what this new council is going to look like.
Well, this is going to be fascinating. This is, I think it's safe to say this is the most diverse council, certainly in modern history, probably ever in New Orleans history. You have 3 black members. You have 2 white members. You have 1 member, Helena Moreno, who identifies as a white Hispanic. You've got, as we were just talking about, Cindy Nguyen, who is the first Vietnamese American on the council, first Asian American on the council. So, you know, this is traditionally, people have looked at the council as, okay, is it 4-3 black? Is it 4-3 white? You know,
or where's the female-male balance?
Male balance, right. Although that is interesting. There's now been a shift in that.
A return to some men on council?
Council, yeah, exactly. But this is going to be a very diverse council. It's, I think, Cindy Nguyen in particular, coming from kind of more of a grassroots, more of a neighborhood approach, is going to be interesting to watch. Palmer also has come from that kind of background, and also faced a similar race against, you know, and again, one of the big themes of this election is that Cedric Richmond's candidates did not do well. Both Nadine Ramsey and James Gray were backed by him. So there's actually a lot of similar dynamics in those races. And, you know, we've only got 2 council, well, we have 2 or 3 council veterans, depending on whether you want to count Palmer as a veteran with her year off. Yeah. So,
term off, yeah.
And the only 2 others that have served before are Brissett and Williams. So that's going to make an interesting dynamic where you've got a majority that's never held council office before.
One thing I'd just add to that is that while we haven't seen a ton of close votes on the council, if you do look at some of the procedural stuff that they've done, there have been quite a few 5-2 votes where you often saw Susan Guidry and Stacey Head kind of on the losing end of that vote. So they're gone, and then 2 of those other members of the 5 are gone. So that really kind of blows things up, I think, a little bit on the council. What I'll be looking for is, where do you start to see those alliances? When you need to get that procedural motion kind of passed and to get kind of that sausage made, where does that get done? I'm not sure I know the answer to that.
And we
right
won't
now.
start seeing that until May, because everybody else is going to be seated there until May. Okay, thanks, guys. Let's go over to Dawn now. And, you know, we've all enjoyed our Thanksgiving dinners, but not everybody is so fortunate, because we do have a problem of hunger here in this community.
We have a large problem with hunger in this community. According to Second Harvest, which serves 23 parishes in South Louisiana, 1 in 5 households in Louisiana is at risk for hunger. I said, what exactly does that mean? What makes you at risk for hunger? And it truly is not knowing where your next meal might come from, or it's making decisions that you have to pay rent or buy food. You have to pay medical bills or buy food. And they say that the face of hunger in our community is changing a good bit. There are oil rig workers who, for the first time ever, are food insecure. People who have had 6-figure jobs before who suddenly don't have jobs and really don't know where their food is coming from. And this time of year, it traditionally does get worse for everybody, particularly in such a heavy service industry area where people don't necessarily have days off. They have to go work their hotel job or their restaurant job, and their kids aren't in school. They have to pay extra money for childcare, and their kids aren't getting those free or reduced breakfasts and lunches at school, so there is a larger grocery bill at home than there normally is during other times of year. They at any given time in our area, there are 210,000 individuals getting food help, but 25,000 seniors need food every month in our area. We are where's my statistic? The 2nd highest state in the United States for seniors who are food insecure. So there is a real need, and that's where, you know, you say, well, how can you help? What really makes a difference? Where is the greatest need? Is it volunteers? Is it the food drives we see around town this time of year? I know my kids were doing one at school. Is it dollars? And dollars are always the most efficient way to help, but they say it really is all 3. $1 can provide a meal, 3 meals for a family, can help provide that. But the food drives really do raise awareness and get the food in there, and at a time of year when things get ramped up, the kids who are learning about food insecurity at school and bringing their cans in really do help supplement during a time of year when they're otherwise busy. Volunteer-wise, Second Harvest sees more than almost 60,000 volunteer hours a year, which would equate to having 29 full-time staff. Instead, they get that through volunteer help. So all of those things, it's all critical. The volunteers, the money, and actually the donations of canned goods. They are seeing the need not necessarily increase, but just change over time. You know, to see the oil workers or to see families with young children, because there is so much help at the school front now. When they're not in school, there's a need.
So you're talking about the whole region too? Not
The
just
whole
city?
region, the 23 parish area the Second Harvest serves, and they, in the past fiscal year, distributed more than 30 million meals with the help of their partner agencies. So it really is a very large problem that's kind of, you know, they say it's a disaster every day. It's not, you know, you didn't get hit by a tornado and you need help now. There is always somebody facing food insecurity.
So donating those cans or packaged foods, or
it really does make a difference.
It does make a big difference.
It truly makes a difference, and it raises the awareness of somebody else who sees you bring that can and might then do the same, or might give that dollar that provides 3 meals.
And these people aren't necessarily like the people we see on street
They're not
street
begging
corners.
on the street corners, but they don't have, you know, I know at my house, on any given day, I can open the pantry and grab something else out. They don't have a pantry full of food at home, and it really is people who are faced with that decision. Do I pay this bill, or do I go to the grocery store? And, you know, it's a balancing act, or almost a shell game. Am I going to lose my apartment if I don't pay rent, or am I going to not eat?
So donations are really, really important.
They're key.
Of various kinds. Okay,
Yes.
Don, thanks a lot. Errol, we have a new treasurer. Well,
We've
elected one.
And there's a sigh of relief throughout the state. We've elected a new state treasurer. This goes back to John Kennedy last year being elected to the Senate to take David Vitter's seat. And so this whole chain reaction, and because of the quirks in the election calendar, it's taken a long time to get to this election. And it's a strange election because the only place where there was anything on the ballot was in New Orleans, where there's mayoral runoff. The rest of the state, there was nothing on the ballot except for this treasurer's race. And it came down to a Republican versus a Democrat, and people just voted party. If you want an idea of the Democrat-Republican split in the state, you can look at this election. John Schroeder, the Republican, had 56% of the vote. Derek Edwards, the Democrat, had 44% of the vote. Edwards carried Orleans Parish. He lost everything else. But around the state, I mean, talk about low voter interest. I was looking at one precinct in Avoyelles Parish. 2 people voted. And they both
must not have had anything else on the ballot.
Well, outside of Orleans and barely in Orleans, nobody knew who these people were.
Well,
I mean,
and that, I think, could have been a really interesting counterfactual with this election. We had this major election in New Orleans that got 33% turnout, which isn't bad. And, you know, I don't remember what the turnout percentages were in the rest of the state, but they were pretty dismal. The Democrats weren't really running you know, I mean, Derek Edwards was out there, but he wasn't really campaigning. It took him until the runoff to get the support of the Democratic Party, even though he was the only Democrat running. So, you know, had there been a strong Democratic treasurer candidate, could this have been an upset by the Democrats? Could they have gotten more
Taken a
turnout?
statewide office.
Yeah, I mean, and they've got the governor's office, but, you know, that
yeah,
would
but
be...
they got the governor's office because of the attacks on David Vitter. I mean, I don't think this would have been that kind of campaign. I think anytime you have a statewide election right now, the Republicans are pretty safe at this point.
Okay, and so we have a Republican for state treasurer.
Right.
That's done.
Which we had already. And he's
so
already
he replaces
campaigning
Republican,
about, I'm going to go to Baton Rouge and we're not going to have any wasteful spending, which was pretty,
So
John
quickly,
Kennedy
he
was
takes
saying.
office when? Do we know?
I think as soon as the votes are counted,
Okay.
it's
Since
they're
he's
probably
filling in
allowed.
a term. Okay.
Why wait? It's been over a year already. This is
Okay, well, something that people are now sort of maybe waiting for is another trip to the Super Bowl.
I think it's to the point where it's getting serious now because the Saints are at 8-2 now, which means they're at a point where it's probably safe to say, unless it's a major folding, that they probably at least have a playoff position, a wild card spot, even if they split the rest of their season, but they could very well go in better position. It's been a big surprise. And, you know, the big thing about the Saints team, people want to compare it to the 2009-2010 Super Bowl team. That team was like the Air Force. I mean, all their scoring was Drew Brees passing. This is like the Marines. I mean, it's ground and air attack. They come from both ways. Have a powerful running game, have a powerful air game. So that's a good combination. And so Drew Brees, who's just like been right on target, doesn't have to pass as much. You can just hand the ball off and let somebody run, and so that's been good too. And the other big surprise over the last few years, since the Super Bowl, the Saints have had a woeful defense. There was one year that the defense was rated the worst NFL defense in history a few years ago, and so they've come back with a very promising and a very impressive defense. And so all the elements are there to have high hopes. Now Philadelphia has a better record, and they're probably the team to get past. But it could happen.
Boy, this past game was pretty amazing the way they came back. I mean,
That last 5 minutes.
if you can survive something like that, but they were very impressive.
And people think about in the Super Bowl season, the Saints also played Washington, and it was a game just like that Washington was leading, and the Saints rallied in the end and pushed it into overtime, and then won on a field goal. The only thing is that game was in Washington, but that game looked like it was going to be a Saints defeat. And so I think people are kind of inspired by that particular game.
Well, Saints fans are certainly enjoying these wins. We hope they keep coming.
And the big thing,
Wish them all the best.
for any team, key injuries could just turn things around in a hurry.
Don't say that, Errol. No, don't say that. We want
if they can stay safe.
we want this trend to continue. Absolutely. Okay, time to look ahead.
The next big election will be the election in Jefferson Parish for a sheriff to fill Newell Norman's seat. That's March 24th. As of now, there seems to be two key players, John Fortunato and the incumbent Joe LaPinto. But we should be hearing a lot about that race now.
And we're starting to see the signs out there in Jefferson Parish now. Kevin.
Yeah, I was just out at the, they just opened this crime real-time monitoring center. Really interesting technology, and a lot of people know that they're rolling out a lot of new cameras, installing over 400 new cameras in the city by early next year. But the other interesting element of this going forward is that they are going to be working on a registration system where people's private security cameras will be registered, they'll be geotagged, and they'll be able to quickly identify where these cameras are. The really interesting thing is, if you want, you can get your camera linked into the city system, and then they can use your camera to also supplement their 400 some cameras. I think it's always interesting when residents get involved in those kind of helping the police kind of situations.
Okay, that is interesting. Thanks, Kevin.
In case you missed it in the hubbub of Thanksgiving, the tree lighting downtown happened on Tuesday night from Claiborne Avenue all the way to the river and all along Convention Center Boulevard. It's lit up for Christmas.
Holiday season is here.
Ho, ho, ho.
Well, we're, as we mentioned, at the start of a 5.5-month transition, so it's there's going to be a lot to watch over the next few months.
Definitely going to be a lot to watch. It'll be very, very interesting to see how this all works.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, thanks a lot, guys, for being here. Thank you all for joining us. Of course, want to see you next week for Informed Sources. Have a good evening.
The firm of Bowen, McLeod & Britt helps both large corporations and small businesses with insurance, risk management, and employee benefits using the same values they've held true for over 30 years: knowledge, vision, accountability, and service. More information is at bmbinc.com.